Awesome. Thank you, Zaina. My name is Dulce Cordova Curry. I'm a student immigration advisor here with ISSA, and I'm excited to be here with you guys. All right. So one of the first things we'll obviously jump into right away is noting that your responsibilities as an F1 student do not end after you graduate. Once you graduate, you will continue to have ISSA responsibilities, immigration and government responsibilities. And as you prepare to leave campus, you'll also be in conversation with multiple ND offices in addition to our office. You'll be in contact with your major department, registrar, OIT, career development. All of these offices and organizations have different requirements and different timelines different mechanisms to engage. So much so that you might feel like you're having another part-time job, just trying to navigate all of it. All of this to say is it's important to remember your responsibilities as an F1 student, and they don't end when you graduate. This is the quick agenda for today. Today we'll quickly cover OPT eligibility, how and when to request it, choosing your OPT start date, filing the I-765. What is the I-765 anyway? Any fees, questions, and also some common mistakes. If you have your I-20 with you, it would be helpful for you to pull it out and review it quickly to make sure that you can spot all the things that are on this screen. Your page 1 has the program end date, and this is what's going to determine your OPT process and timeline. You should all look at that. For the majority will be May grads. Others might not. Others are ahead of the game and are preparing for next year. Others might have a different end date. But this is essentially what's going to drive your OPT process. You'll also want to confirm that your major or your majors are correctly reflected, as this impacts what kind of jobs you can take when you file for OPT. The signatures on your Form I-20 are also important. Ensure that you have a signature on your I-20 from our office. Ensure that you have signed and printed the document, the I-20, when you're ready to file, and we'll cover that a little bit later. But make sure that you look at those signatures. And page 2 will have employment authorization. So likely it's blank right now and you don't have anything on it. But that's essentially where you'll see that OPT has been requested, and we'll talk about that later on in the presentation. OPT. OPT is a 12-month authorization and a benefit of your F1 status, allowing you to get real work experience related to your field of study as is listed on the Form I-20. Like I mentioned before, as the majors that are listed on your Form I-20. While OPT is 12 months of work authorization, students that have a STEM eligible degree may be eligible for an additional 24 months of OPT, but we will cover that in a separate presentation. Sorry, I'm going to scoot this over. So who is eligible to apply for OPT? F1 students that have a valid status at the time of the application. If you've been enrolled full-time in the U.S. and have at least one academic year, you have not completed OPT at this same academic level, you have less than 12 months of full-time CPT authorization at this academic level, are present in the U.S. when filing, this is important, we'll talk about this later, and have an I-20 with OPT recommendation from our office. We will go over the exact timeline soon in the next section, I'm sorry. But you must continue to maintain status. Remember what we said, it was going to feel like a little bit of a part-time job. Maintaining part of the status will require reporting it on top of it all. Is your job offer, I'm so sorry. Is the job offer required to apply? It's not, but employment authorization period will start within 60 days of the program end date, and it is limited to 12 months. Students are allowed for 90 days of unemployment with that authorization period, and we'll go over what that looks like later. During your OPT, for the whole duration of your OPT and STEM OPT, you will continue to be an F1 status and must maintain that status. Okay, so here are the check-in questions from the big bright yellow slide that Zaina mentioned. So really quickly, we'll ask the first question, see if you guys, how much of what I said you caught. Really quickly, you can drop on your chat, how soon can I apply for OPT? And we have our first answer. Great job. Anybody else, feel free to drop one. Oh, some people are already answering the next question. True or false? I must have an employment offer to apply for OPT. Great. All right. Great job paying attention. Did I step Ramon? Genius. Great, great, great. Will your F1 status change while you're on OPT? This one's the tricky one, but no, correct. Awesome. Awesome. We'll go back and put the Q&A. We'll fix the Q&A, Anna. Thank you for that. And then with that, great job. You guys did a fantastic job on these check-in questions. I'll pass it over to Zaina.
Hi, friends. Sorry, I'm not sure what's going on with the Q&A feature. It looks like it's on my end, but Dulce, maybe you can take a look at that as we move on to the next portion of the presentation. So I am going to cover more in depth what this OPT process looks like. So we have this kind of visual here to help you understand the most important steps throughout this process. Something I also like to mention is that this entire process is listed out in a step-by-step manner on our OPT webpage. So if you haven't already taken a look at our OPT webpage, all this information that we're covering tonight also exists there. So do be sure at some point to check that out. So the first step is to submit the OPT application I-20 request form in ISSA link. And we are going to cover exactly what that looks like and what to do a little bit later on in the presentation. But you all will have the opportunity to do that in today's session to request that OPT I-20, and then ISSA will be able to start processing them in the coming days. Of course, once ISSA processes your I-20 request, we will send it to you as a PDF attachment, and you will print it out, sign it. And on page 2, as Dulce mentioned, right now, the I-20 that you all have it currently does not have work authorization on page 2. But when we give you the new OPT I-20, which is required to apply for OPT, you will see that on page 2, and we're going to show you a visual in just a minute, on page 2, there will be an OPT recommendation. So you submit that request, you receive the I-20 from ISSA that has the OPT recommendation. You're going to prepare your required documents to formally apply to USCIS for OPT. So it may be helpful to think of this process. Imagine there was a line right here down the middle, right? The first 3 steps, those are between you and ISSA. You need to request a new I-20 from ISSA. ISSA gives you that new I-20. The second half, these last 3 steps, are between you and USCIS. So it's kind of a 2-pronged process. So you need to get the I-20 from ISSA. You need to formally submit the I-765 to USCIS. And you're going to do this through USCIS's online account site. And we're going to show you a little bit about what that looks like as well in a few minutes. You're going to submit that application, and then you're going to monitor your application through that same USCIS account. So you're going to monitor any notices that you receive, any follow-up from USCIS, and then hopefully an approval from USCIS for your OPT application, which then ultimately will result in you getting an EAD card, an employment authorization document, as the final step. So first of all, we're going to backtrack just a little bit. So right now, if you have your I-20 with you, go ahead and get it out. If you don't, that's okay. You can always watch the recording of this and take a look at your I-20 later. But right now, we want you to take a look on page 1 of your I-20 under program date information, which is kind of around the middle of the page. On page 1, you'll see your program dates. We want you to pay particular attention to your program end date. And the reason for this is because the I-20 program end date is really what's driving this OPT timeline. So your OPT timeline depends on what that date is. For most of you, if you are graduating this May 2025, it will say May 18th, 2025. If it says something later than that, for example, if you're a PhD student and you thought you were going to graduate in May 2026, or your I-20 says May 2026, but you're actually graduating in May 2025, that will get corrected through the OPT process. So once you request your OPT I-20 from ISSA, your department is going to confirm that you're graduating, and ISSA will shorten that program end date to May 18th, 2025, and you will still be totally good for this OPT timeline. So, like I said, most of you who are graduating this May 2025 have this May 18th program end date. The reason that it determines the OPT timeline, and we're going to get to this more in just a second, is because you can only apply for OPT 90 days before the program end date listed there. And so if you're attending this session, but you're actually a summer grad, and you're not graduating until summer 2025, the timeline in terms of the days is still going to be relevant to you, but the exact dates are just going to shift with your program end date. Something else to keep in mind as we're thinking about this I-20 program end date is that once that program end date passes, on-campus employment, right? Employment done at the University of Notre Dame and paid by the University of Notre Dame will become off-campus employment, which means that if you have an on-campus job and you plan to continue working at Notre Dame, let's say maybe you're doing research and you plan to continue doing research on your OPT, as of May 18th, 2025, if you're a May grad, that is no longer going to be considered on-campus employment. And so you won't be able to continue working for Notre Dame after the program end date on your I-20 until you've been approved for OPT and you can be rehired under this new work authorization. So I know that's a little bit different because all of you did not need any sort of authorization to work on campus. But after that program end date, even work at the university is considered off-campus employment. A special note for our graduate students with a thesis or dissertation requirement, so primarily our PhD students here. So you as a PhD student are going to get a little bit more flexibility with what exactly this program end date is. So for example, if you have a program end date that is maybe in the summer, you're not actually going to graduate until the summer, but you're defending your dissertation in, let's say, May 1st, then you may be able to choose that May 1st date as the program end date for the purposes of applying for OPT, even though we understand you're still going to be a matriculated student at the university after that date. Again, that would impact your ability to receive a stipend from the university because you wouldn't be able to continue getting paid after that program end date until you had been approved for OPT. And so for our PhD students, you really get the choice when you're thinking about your program end date between the dissertation defense date, that's a really common one, the dissertation submission date, once you make all of your revisions and you submit the final version of your dissertation, maybe the last day of your TA responsibilities or the last day of required research in a lab with your advisor. And then the final option is the actual graduation date in that semester. So for example, if you're not actually being conferred your degree until the summer, maybe you apply for OPT based off of a summer 2026 graduation date. And the decision, which one you choose, will be highly impacted by your employment timeline after you graduate, or if you have a job lined up, that sort of thing. If you have further questions, I would advise that you come talk to ISSA one-on-one so that we can give you a tailored answer for your situation. So the last bullet point here is to understand the distinction between your Notre Dame student status and your F1 immigration status. And the reason that's important is because, again, this is primarily going to be relevant for our graduate students. If you are using your dissertation defense date, for example, as your completion date, that's the date that we're going to shorten your I-20 program end date to. And that's the date that is going to determine your OPT timeline. even though, like I said, you might still be considered a student and you may still be enrolled at the university until you're actually conferred the degree. So that's important to understand that if you apply for OPT based on an earlier completion date, in the eyes of the US government, your status is no longer based on your enrollment at the university, it's based on your employment on OPT. If we have questions about that, feel free to put them in the chat or the Q&A, and we will answer them a little bit later. So we talked about this general application timeline. So when we say that the program end date determines the OPT timeline, what we mean by that is that, like I said, the big day is 90 days, or the big timeline is 90 days. 90 days before that program end date is the earliest that you can apply for OPT, which means, and we're going to give you another visual on the next slide, that for those of you with a May 18th completion date, the 90th day before May 18th puts you at February 17th. And so that's going to be the earliest possible day that you could submit your OPT application to USCIS. 30 days is another important timeline. So we tried to put this in a visually appealing format. So 30, 90, 60. So 30 days is another important timeline, because once ISSA gives you that I-20 with the OPT recommendation, that recommendation is only valid for 30 days. What that means is that you have to apply for OPT within 30 days of when ISSA gives you that I-20. If you don't apply within 30 days, it doesn't mean that you can't apply for OPT anymore. It just means you need to get a new I-20 before you can apply for OPT. So another way of saying that is that if ISSA gives you an OPT I-20 and you have not filed your OPT application within 30 days, come get a new I-20 from ISSA so that we can facilitate a new OPT application for you. So the recommendation only valid for 30 days. The final timeline here, 60 days. So this is the amount of time that you have after your program end date. Those are the days in which you can choose your OPT authorization to start. So for example, for those of you that have a May 18th graduation date, the earliest possible date that you could request your OPT authorization to start is the next day. So that would be May 19th of 2025. Or you could choose the latest possible date, which would be 60 days after that date, which we have put this conveniently in a nice visual format. The latest possible date would be the 60th day after May 18th, which would be July 17th of 2025. So you could request your OPT to start anytime between May 19th, the day after your program end date, through July 17th. We're going to cover a little bit about the factors that will go into you deciding what that OPT start date is in just a little bit. So just to confirm, this is the timeline that we're working with for May 18th grads. If your program end date on your I-20 is not May 18th, if it's later, that's fine. This 30, 60, 90 day timeline, it still applies to you. This timeline is just going to shift based on whatever your program end date is. So like we said, 90 days before May 18th puts you here at February 17th. That's the earliest date to file the I-765 application. We mentioned that in order to do that, you need an I-20 from ISSA. You are already here at today's session, so you've completed this first step. And at the end of the session, we're going to invite you to complete that OPT I-20 request in ISSA Link. So you will have already submitted this request. The reason we have you all submit it now is so that we have time to process the hundreds of requests that we're going to be getting from all of you, so that by February 17th, you have your I-20 to submit that application. So like I said, at the end of the session, we're going to invite you to request your I-20. I would highly encourage you to go ahead and request it today so that we can go ahead and begin processing. We do usually ask students for 5 to 7 business days for any request. And so we do need that time. So anyway, the next item on here, this March 15th date, this is just the date by which we recommend that all students file their I-765. The I-765 is the formal application for work authorization for your OPT that you submit to USCIS. So we advise that you submit that by March 15th. That is before Notre Dame's spring break. If you are not sure about applying for OPT, if you're still not sure what your plans are, and you don't apply for OPT before you leave for spring break, if you have international travel plans, just keep in mind you can only submit your OPT application from within the United States. So we highly encourage students to do it before March 15th. But if you're traveling over spring break outside of the US and you haven't applied, you'll have to wait until you get back from spring break to submit that application. So I mentioned that we're going to give you a little bit more information to help you choose your OPT start date. So like we mentioned, the authorization start date has to be within 60 days following your program end date. So it must be within that 60-day period. The latest possible start date, as we mentioned, would be July 17th of 2020. I'm sorry, 17th of 2025. So a few things to keep in mind. The first thing is that some of you may already have offers of employment. The authorization dates that you choose for your OPT may be different than your actual employment dates. So an example of this is many students may have an offer of employment that begins after July 17th, 2025. Let's say, for example, your employer says, I want you to start working on August 1st. What that means is that, like we said, your OPT authorization start date, the latest it can be is July 17th. What that means is that between July 17th and when you actually start working on August 1st, you're going to accrue some days of unemployment. And we're going to cover what those days of unemployment mean a little bit later in the presentation. So those authorization dates may be different than your employment dates. Of course, if you have an offer of employment and your employer would like you to start working on June 15th, then it makes sense that you would choose June 15th as your OPT start date. So a lot of things about your potential employment situation would impact the OPT start date that you choose. Most students who don't have an offer of employment at the time that they apply for OPT will choose the latest possible start date of July 17th, because that gives you the maximum amount of time to search and find a job without using those days of unemployment. Another thing to keep in mind is that once you submit the OPT application to USCIS, once you've submitted that I-765, the authorization dates that you've requested for your OPT cannot be changed unless you formally withdraw the OPT application and then you refile, which is a very tedious process and it's not something we would advise. So once you submit that application, be really sure about those OPT dates. If you request an I-20 and a week later you haven't submitted your OPT application, and you decide you'd like to change the requested OPT start date, come talk to ISSA and we can update the recommendation for you. But like I said, once you submit the OPT application to USCIS, those requested authorization dates cannot be changed. So with a May 18th, 2025 program end date, the earliest authorization date would be May 19th, so the day after the end of your program. The latest authorization date would be July 17th, 2025. That is 60 days after the May 18th completion date. And then a helpful note is that the authorization end date will never be later than July 16th of 2026. Now, the reason that we mention this is because if you choose the latest possible start date of July 17th, exactly 12 months later is July 16th of 2026. If for some reason you don't submit your application in a timely manner and USCIS cannot approve your OPT application by the latest possible start date, which is July 17th, it's important to understand that you will be losing a little bit of time off of your 12 months of OPT. So if you apply, let's say on July 1st for OPT and you request the latest possible start date of July 17th, well, USCIS is taking a long time, like 3 to 4 months to process OPT applications. So you're not going to get approved until several months later. No matter what the start date is on your OPT, let's say it's September 30th, the end date will still be July 16th. You're never going to get a later OPT end date than July 16th of 2026. So the gist of that is to not wait to apply for OPT and to apply as early as possible, which is, as we've mentioned, on February 17th, 90 days before your program end date. So a few factors that influence your requested start date decision. So the first one is your desired flexibility. If you choose an earlier start date within that 60-day window, you'll get more flexibility to begin working as soon as you have an offer. Versus if you choose a later start date, if you choose, let's say, the last possible start date, July 17th, and you get an offer of employment to start on June 1st, well, unfortunately, you've already submitted your OPT application. Your EAD card is going to have a July 17th start date. So you wouldn't be able to accept that offer to start working on June 1st. So you'd have to talk to your employer and see if they could shift that OPT start date. Whereas if you requested an earlier start date, you would have the employment authorization and you could start working whenever you had an offer. The job offer start date. So as I mentioned, if you already have a job offer in place, then it makes sense for you to choose that as your OPT start date. So like I said, if you have an employment, if you have a job starting on June 15th, it probably makes the most sense for you to choose June 15th as your OPT start date. Any travel plans you might have. So if you are planning to travel home to visit family after you graduate, let's say you want a month of vacation, you've just spent many years completing this Notre Dame degree, you want to relax for a little bit before you throw yourself into a job, that's fine. You would probably choose an OPT start date that is after you plan to be back in the United States. So maybe consider your travel plans in choosing your start date. And then, of course, any sort of unexpected opportunities that might come up. This kind of goes in line with that desired flexibility. A lot of times students choose the latest possible start date. And then they get like an offer to do research on campus at Notre Dame. They get a research position and they want to start working, but they requested the latest possible start date. Again, unfortunately, those unexpected opportunities that come up, you wouldn't be able to take advantage of them if you chose that latest possible start date, unless the employer was willing to be flexible with the start date. So really quickly, we mentioned that at the end of this OPT process, you get this pink looking card, which is called an EAD card, an employment authorization document. And this is what it will look like. If you're approved for OPT, this is what you will receive. Of course, it will have your listed information. It will have the validity dates, so your OPT authorization dates on the card as well. So you'll know exactly when you're authorized to work. They will be listed on that EAD card. Important to remember that you should not begin working before you receive the card or until you've reached the start date on the card. So if you receive your card on June 15th, but your OPT start date isn't until July 17th, you still cannot work until July 17th if that was your OPT start date. The EAD card by itself is not a travel document. So when you get the EAD card, we always get students who ask, my EAD card says not valid for reentry to US. Does that mean I can't travel? No, it just means that the EAD card doesn't replace like your passport. You would have to have the EAD card along with your passport, your valid F1 visa, your I-20, an offer of employment, like all of the other advised travel documents, which ISSA provides that information to you. It's on our webpage as well, but you can't use the EAD card by itself to travel. You still need a valid F1 visa and the other documents in order to re-enter the US. When you are approved for OPT, you will get an approval notice, which is like a piece of paper that tells you that your I-765 was approved. That will usually come before the EAD card. An approval notice from USCIS is not the same as an EAD card, and it does not mean that you can begin working. You will have to have the EAD card in hand in order to begin working. The approval notice is just that. It's notifying you that USCIS approved the application. It is not work authorization, and you'll have to wait, as I said, until you have this EAD card in hand to begin working. Once you get that EAD card, just a reminder to make sure that it's correct, review the information. If there are any inaccuracies or you have any questions, you can always reach out to ISSA for instructions, and we can always advise you on next steps. So we talked a little bit about travel. So travel and OPT. I'll note that we have a travel webpage that also has an after graduation travel section. This information is not something you have to memorize. It's going to be available to you for the entire time that you're on your OPT. So a few reminders about travel. It really depends on where you are at with your OPT application and where you are at with regard to your program end date on your I-20. That is what will impact our advice with regards to international travel. So we will start actually at the bottom here, before I-20 program end date. If you are currently in your program, you are still enrolled in classes, it is before your May 18th, 2025 I-20 program end date. Our advice regarding travel is the same. There is a normal travel risk. Make sure you have all of the normal documents that we've advised you to carry for your entire time at Notre Dame. There is no different advice if you are traveling internationally before the end of your Notre Dame program. It doesn't matter if you've submitted an application, if your application has been approved, if you haven't applied for OPT, there's no change in our advice with regards to travel before the program end date. Now, after the program end date is where it depends on the status of your OPT application. So if it is after your program end date, we're going to go back up to the top here, actually. If it's after your program end date on your I-20 and you have not submitted your OPT application yet, which of course we wouldn't advise because we know that ISSA advises you to apply as soon as possible. But if you haven't submitted the OPT application, you should not travel if you plan to apply for OPT. If you leave the US during your 60-day grace period after your program end date, your F1 status will be completed. You will not be eligible anymore to apply for OPT or to re-enter the United States in F1 status. So just keep that in mind. That is if you have not submitted any OPT application. If it is after your I-20 end date, and you have submitted an application and the application is still pending with USCIS, that is the only time that ISSA would not advise travel. Again, after your program end date, so after May 18th, 2025, if your application is still pending, we would say don't travel until you have been approved and you have your EAD card. This would be the riskiest time to exit the US. And so this is the only time that we would not advise travel. If it is after your I-20 program end date and your post-OPT has been approved, it is a normal travel risk. You can travel as long as you have your valid documents, which after you've been approved for OPT includes that EAD card. Again, we have a travel webpage for students after graduation, so specifically our students on OPT, and we list out all of the recommended travel documents, which are basically everything you've carried up until now, with the addition of your EAD card, and if you have a job, an offer letter confirming your employment. So again, just to reiterate, there is normal travel risk except during the period after your program ends before your OPT application gets approved. At the bottom, we have a note. If your F1 visa has expired or is going to be expiring soon, we would advise waiting until after your OPT is approved before you exit the US to renew it. And the reason for that is because you have to have a valid F1 visa to return to the US. And if you go to apply for the visa and you are at the end of your program and your OPT has not yet been approved, then you don't really have documented proof that you need to extend your F1 status. So we would just say, to make things as smooth as possible to avoid any unnecessary risk, wait to renew the visa until the OPT approval has come through and you have your EAD card that you can bring to the appointment with you. So a few examples here, just to kind of help solidify some of the information that we've covered. So we have these students. So our first student here is Yang. So Yang has a job offer for OPT. He has requested that his OPT start date be July 17th, so the latest possible start date. He wants to visit home before starting work. So given this scenario, we would say that he can travel, of course, but after his program end date, as long as his OPT has been approved. And then he has now chosen the latest possible start date. So he just needs to make sure that he comes back to the US to begin working before his July 17th start date. But he is good to travel outside of the US after May 18th, as long as his OPT has been approved, to visit home, to relax, to take a vacation, whatever. And then he can return to the US with all of his documents to begin working on July 17th, which is the start of his OPT. So our next student requested, let's say they requested their OPT I-20, but ultimately decided not to apply for OPT. They got a great job in their home country, and they want to work from their home country after graduation. If that's the case, our student Ahan, their only responsibility is to let ISSA know that they've decided to not pursue OPT and that they want to end their F1 status to return back home. They just have to make ISSA aware so that we can update the record. There's no problem. Our next student, Claire, doesn't have a job offer, but is actively looking for employment and does not plan to travel. In this case, there is nothing specific that Claire needs to do, but Claire would probably choose the latest possible start date since she doesn't have an offer of employment. So she'd probably choose July 17th so that she has maximum amount of time to look for a job. And then she is still good for travel if she, again, after May 18th, if she has an approval for OPT, even if she doesn't have an offer, she is okay to travel. So that's Claire. So our final student, Fatima has a job offer, but her employment start date for her OPT, her employment start date is September 1st. In Fatima's case, we would advise her to choose the latest possible start date of July 17th because she's going to accrue days of unemployment. She cannot choose September 1st as the start date because that's outside of the 60-day window. So she's going to choose July 17th. And between July 17th and September 1st, Fatima is going to accrue days of unemployment. Over the 12-month period, students have 90 days that they can be unemployed. So Fatima is going to use about 2 months out of those 3 months of unemployment before actually starting her job while on OPT. All right, so we didn't have a check-in question at the end of this section, but there is a check-in question at the end of the next section. So I'm sorry that you're hearing my voice for such a long period of time, but hopefully it's making sense. All right, so back to this application process. This is really where we're going to get into the nitty-gritty of what exactly this process looks like from start to finish. So like I said, imagine there was a line right here down the middle. To the left of this line, so steps 1, 2, and 3, that's going to be between you as the student and ISSA because you need the I-20 from ISSA. Between 4, 5, and 6, that is between you and USCIS. You need to create your USCIS account, file your I-765, and hopefully get your EAD card when your application gets approved. So it's a two-pronged process. So this is a screenshot of ISSA link. So this is where we are going to direct you towards the end of this presentation to request your OPT I-20. This is what it looks like when you navigate to the My USCIS website. This is where you're going to create your USCIS account, and this is where you are ultimately going to file your I-765. Again, the I-765, it's a general application for work authorization, but that is what you are going to complete to request your OPT. And then this lovely end result here, if everything goes to plan, you get your I-20, you use it to file your I-765, and then happy days, you get this lovely pink little tiny card, and that will be how you know that you're approved for OPT. So again, ISSA recommends you for OPT in the form of a new I-20, and then USCIS authorizes you. How do you know that you're authorized? Well, you get this pretty pink card that has your OPT authorization dates on it. So again, this is a screenshot of what it looks like in ISSA link. You're going to complete this request initial OPT I-20. That's going to be your first step. Once ISSA processes your I-20, I mentioned that you're going to see on page 2, under your employment authorizations, you're going to see post-completion OPT requested, and then you're going to see the dates that you requested for your OPT authorization. We recommend you for those dates, and then we give you this I-20 with that recommendation. As we mentioned right now, for most of you, unless you have CPT, this is probably blank. And so when we give you the new I-20, that is how you'll know that you're recommended for OPT, is because it has this recommendation on page 2. Just a quick note is that even if you are in a field that is STEM eligible, you are only applying for the first 12 months of OPT now. So all of the documentation that you submit in ISSA link will be with regard to OPT or post-completion OPT. This is that first 12 months and not STEM OPT. You are eligible for STEM OPT, but you are not applying for those extra 2 years right now. So we just want to confirm that. We will talk about it in another slide towards the end. So just another reminder, ISSA recommends and USCIS authorizes. The reason that we keep harping on this is because we had a record number of students apply either they submitted their I-765 without ISSA's I-20. That will be an automatic rejection, and it will be sad for you. It will be sad for us because you will have submitted that application and you will be denied because you didn't have the OPT recommendation from the university. And we don't want you to get denied. You don't want you to get denied. So let's all make sure that you don't get denied. So that's why we keep harping on this. Make sure you get your I-20 and you use it to submit that I-765. So what exactly does this I-765 process entail? So when you get that I-20 from ISSA, you're going to review the information, of course, make sure it's correct. You're going to print the I-20 out and you're going to hand sign it. So as Dulce mentioned at the beginning, the DSO, the person at ISSA that gives you the I-20, is going to have electronically signed the document. You cannot electronically sign it. You are going to hand sign it and you're going to take a picture of it that you're going to use to upload to your I-765. So make sure that you have a document, your I-20, with a hand signed signature. The second step is to prepare electronic documents of all of these things. It's nothing crazy. You know you're going to have your I-20 with the OPT recommendation, a copy of the bio page, just the picture in your passport with your picture on it, some passport style photos. You can get these done in the basement of the La Fortune Student Center if you're not sure where to get a passport photo taken. The most recent I-94 record. Hopefully all of you at this point know how to access your I-94. Any previous I-20s with work authorization, so CPT, if you've ever had CPT, you're going to need to have your I-20 for that. If you are a grad student and you had OPT in the US at a previous degree level, if you did your undergrad in the US and you did OPT, you'll need to have a copy of your EAD card. And then you're going to need to have credit card information to pay the I-765 filing fee. That fee is currently $470. So anyone filing the I-765 is going to have to pay $470 to submit that application. That is a government fee. That is not ISSA's fee, just to confirm. Once you have all of this documentation, you're going to create a USCIS account, again, on this page. And then you're going to file the I-765. Once you submit it and you make that payment, you're going to use this site to monitor the progress of your application. The status of the application will change as your application moves through the USCIS processing. So one thing we want to mention, so we mentioned that the processing time right now for USCIS to process an I-765 for OPT is about 3 to 4 months. We understand that that is quite a long time. We at ISSA have no control over the USCIS processing time. So students are often asking, is there a way to make them process my application faster? This is the only way to have USCIS process your application faster. That is through a process called premium processing. So premium processing recently became available to students applying for OPT. You can choose to apply for premium processing with the I-765 application. So you can do it at the same time that you file the application. Or if you don't apply for premium processing, but 30 days down the line, you decide that you absolutely want to have your OPT authorization as soon as possible, you can choose to file for premium processing later, after you've already submitted the I-765. Totally fine. What premium processing is it ensures that USCIS adjudicates your application. So it ensures that you'll get a decision on your OPT application within 30 days of when you submit the premium processing application. Just to confirm, it guarantees a decision on your application, but it doesn't guarantee an approval, and it doesn't guarantee that that is when you're going to have your EAD card in hand. Because keep in mind, they may approve you for OPT, but they still have to mail you your EAD card. We have seen students who apply for premium processing getting approved in about 2 to 3 weeks. So it is very quick. However, many students do not apply for premium processing because it is prohibitively expensive. In addition to the $470 that every student who applies for OPT will pay, premium processing costs, everyone sit down, an additional $1,685, which means in total, you will be paying a little over $2,000 for your OPT application. So just something to consider. We want to make sure that you're aware that it is an option. But if you don't choose to do it, you can anticipate a processing time of around 3.5 months, give or take, depending on what USCIS, what their processing time is at a given, time of the year. Of course, keep in mind, all students at all US institutions who are graduating this May will be applying for OPT at the same time. So this is going to be a very busy season for USCIS, and that is why the processing time is so long. A few notes about the USCIS processing. The first one, super important. Contact ISSA immediately if you find out that your application was rejected or denied. As soon as you find out, let ISSA know so that we can advise you on next steps. If you're rejected or denied, but you're still within your eligibility window to reapply, we can issue you a new I-20 to facilitate a new application. Or we can advise you on next steps if ultimately that's not possible. So if you find out that you are rejected or denied, or if you receive any sort of follow-up from USCIS, let ISSA know. You are still an F1 student on your OPT who is sponsored by the University of Notre Dame. What that means is that you still have full access to ISSA's advising services, and we're here to support you throughout this entire OPT process, throughout your entire OPT, potentially STEM OPT. So let us know so that we can help you. The next thing, which I mentioned previously, is that you're going to receive an approval notice before you receive the EAD card. And again, that approval notice is just notifying you of your approval for your OPT. It is not work authorization, and you can't use it to begin working. USCIS, this is kind of like what I was just saying, they don't guarantee processing times, which means that their processing times might shift. For example, last year, students who applied in February and the first week of March got approved for OPT in about 2 months. Students who applied after the first week of March were waiting nearly 4 months. And so they don't guarantee processing times. However, what they do is they give an estimated timeline, which they consider to be normal processing. If your application is still within normal processing times, which is, I believe right now, 3 to 5 months, they will not give you any specific updates about your application. So if you've been waiting 3.5 months and you're getting really, frustrated and you're not sure what's happening, USCIS will not be able to provide further information. And we at ISSA cannot make any sort of formal inquiry about the application until it's outside of their normal processing times. Even though, of course, we recognize that their idea of a normal processing time is very, very long. Premium processing, as I mentioned, is available at any point in the process, and it only guarantees a decision on your application within 30 days of when you file it. I do often tell students that if you choose to apply for premium processing, it probably makes the most sense to apply at the same time that you apply that you submit the I-765. The reason for that is because sometimes I'll see students who apply for OPT. 2 months later, they get really nervous and they apply for premium processing. And then 30 days later, they get the approval. Maybe they would have gotten the approval in another week or two if they didn't pay that $1,685. So anyway, just kind of take that timeline into consideration. And usually if you want to apply for premium processing, I typically advise students to just go ahead and do it at the time you submit the I-765. A few common mistakes to avoid as you're completing this I-765. The first one, do not file the I-765 early. I mentioned that you all will be able to submit your request for the OPT I-20 after today's session. You might get your I-20 for your OPT application before February 17th, so before that earliest filing date. That does not mean that you can submit the OPT application before that 90th day on February 17th. You should still wait until February 17th to apply. If you file the I-765 early, it will be an automatic rejection. So we don't want that. You don't want that. Don't file the I-765 early. Choose the correct eligibility category. For post-completion OPT, this category, which you're going to have to indicate on the I-765, is C3B. Again, you might be STEM eligible. You might be in a STEM eligible major. Do not choose the STEM OPT category, which is C3C. All of you students who are graduating in May and planning to work after May 18th will choose C3B as the category. That information is also on our website. Make sure that you file the I-765 within 30 days of ISSA giving you the I-20 with the OPT recommendation. Like we mentioned earlier, that recommendation is only valid for 30 days. If you don't file your OPT application within 30 days and you use the same I-20 to apply after the 30-day mark, it will be an automatic rejection. And they may take 3 months just to tell you that they denied your application. It is heartbreaking for students. It's heartbreaking for us. And we had so many students last year use their OPT I-20 that was issued more than 30 days ago to apply for OPT. And then they were devastated when they were denied for OPT. So make sure to file within 30 days of getting that recommendation. If you don't apply within 30 days, doesn't mean you can't apply for OPT. You just have to get a new recommendation from ISSA to restart that 30 days. So come talk to us if you're not sure, or if you're getting close to that 30 days. Make sure that you sign your I-20 after printing it and before uploading it to your I-765. So you're going to review it, you're going to print it out, you're going to hand sign it, and you're going to scan a photo of the I-20 to upload to your I-765 application. Okay, so after all of that talking, finally, our check-in questions. So everybody in the chat, the first question, what is your immigration status while you are on OPT? Is it A, OPT visa? Is it B, F1 status? Or is it C, H1B? Okay, amazing. We have all students submitted the correct answer. I love it. Correct. OPT visa is not a thing. There is no visa called OPT. You are an F1 student on an F1 visa using your OPT benefit, which is a benefit of the F1 status. Correct. So glad no one put C. So good work. Number 2, what is the status? Okay, this is not a good, well-written question. I apologize. What is the status of your dependents while you are on OPT? What status are they in? So this may not apply to those of you who don't have spouses or children in the US with you, but what is their status? Yes, F2, exactly. So your F2 dependents, your spouses and children who are here with you, their status will be extended when your status is extended. So once your F1 status is extended for OPT, they will get new I-20s as well. When we issue your OPT I-20, there will be more I-20s for all of your dependents. Their status is entirely based on yours. They are still in F2 status. All right. And finally, who is the sponsor of your immigration status while you are on OPT? AKA, who advises you about your record while you're on OPT? Is it, I don't know why we did 1, 2, 3. Is it A, ISSA or Notre Dame? Is it B, my employer? Is it C, my academic advisor or DGS? Yes, amazing. ISSA, the best team. You guys are too kind. Okay, great. Amazing. It is ISSA. So to confirm, ISSA is the sponsor of your F1 status while you're on OPT. You have full access to ISSA's resources, to our advising. We are here with you for the long term. For now, if you apply for STEM OPT, you will still be an F1 student sponsored by the University of Notre Dame. ISSA is still your point of contact. This is another way of saying that you should not ask questions about your immigration status to your employer unless they are, sponsoring you for another immigration status, or to your advisor or DGS. Any questions about your immigration status while you're on OPT should still be directed to ISSA. Great work. So after all of that talking, I get to hand it back over to Dulce.
Awesome. Thank you for that, Sina. Everybody had some really good questions. Hopefully we can finish answering some of the questions that they had. All right, we'll jump right in. So earlier in the presentation, we talked about the importance of your major. As we talk about what employment you can have for while you're on OPT, it must be related to your major. So your major, again, Zena talked a little bit about it. So when you're thinking about any OPT employment, remember that it has to be related to your major. Employment must be full-time at a minimum of 20 hours per week for it to be considered full-time and for it to be considered to part of your OPT. Anything below 20 hours would not be considered full-time employment. And at that point, we can begin to accumulate unemployment days, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Your employment must be US based. If you are not working in the US, you don't need the authorization. So it's just important to remember that OPT is for US based employment. And it must be reported. We have talked a little bit about reporting, and we will continue to talk about the importance of reporting. Everything should be reported, ideally as soon as possible, but definitely within 10 days of any end of employment, change of employment, changes in employer's address, etc. Everything should be reported. Your job, as we mentioned before, should be directly related to your academic field of study as it is listed on your I-20. So when you are reporting, you will need to prepare a short statement just connecting your studies and your employment. We have two samples here that just basically help us make that connection between your major and your employment. So I'll read really quick the second option here, and then we'll talk about why that is a good explanation. It doesn't have to be really long, but it does have to have enough detail, not be vague. It should have enough information. So this particular student has a bachelor's degree in business. He works full-time as a loan officer at a mortgage company, Happy Homes, where he meets clients, evaluates, authorizes, recommends approval of loan applications, and on a daily basis, he uses knowledge gained in his credit analysis sales, marketing classes that he took as part of his major program of study. Again, so this is a good example because he talked about his the company that he works for. He named it. He talked about the courses that he took, and he talked about his specific tasks and responsibilities. And so really quickly in the slide, at the bottom of the slide, we have a link of other ways, other examples that explain connecting your particular major field of study to your employment. And slide 32. All the employment that is authorized while you are an OPT. Remember that employment during the first 12 months has to be directly related to your field of study. We're going to say that until it's blue in the face, but essentially you can have regular paid employment, payments by multiple short-term employers, independent contractor positions, self-employment, employment through an employment agency, volunteer or unpaid internship where no labor laws are violated. And that is an important thing to know, that you can volunteer and you can do unpaid internships while on OPT. So as long as nothing of the no labor laws have been violated. And on our website, we have a little bit of information of what those laws are and when they would be considered a violation. If you were to do self-employment, it's just important to remember that you need to follow the proper procedures and employment laws that require for you to start a business that way. Next slide. So we've talked about reporting employment and working. But what would happen when you can't find employment, or you lose employment, or you're not currently employed, right? So within those 12 months of OPT authorization, you have a total of 90 cumulative days of unemployment. So employment begins by the 90th day. So you have to be employed and must report employment so that you don't accumulate the 90 days. Your EAD authorization dates begin on the OPT start date, unless you report employment. So earlier we had a question that what's the difference between the start date of your work and the authorization of your OPT. So if your start date is June 1st, and you, I'm sorry, if your, yes, I'm sorry, if your start date is June 1st and you didn't start work until June 5th, you would have accumulated those days of unemployment, right? So from June 1st to June 4th, you would have accumulated unemployment days. And so it's important that you go ahead and report that so that because if you start working in June 1st because you were authorized to work in June 1st and you never reported that, we'll never know. And at that point, you'll use up all unemployment days. Your record can complete and we'll never know. So it is important that you pay attention to that reportment. Please note that vacation days, holidays, and weekends while you are employed don't typically count toward any days of unemployment. So if you're employed by a company and you have Christmas break, 2 weeks Christmas break, you're very lucky, but also you don't have to report that as it is not considered unemployment. All right, and now for a quick checkpoint. OPT, we just talked about it. It's not a lot of information that we've given you, but really quickly on the chat, go ahead and chat your answers. OPT employment is paid or unpaid? All right, so actually it can be both. Remember we talked about in the previous slide that employment can be paid internship and I'm sorry, it could be paid employment, it could be volunteer or unpaid internships. So if you have a volunteer opportunity, likely you're not getting paid for that. So it can be both paid or unpaid. Our next question is, can I report employment for a non-US based employer to keep my OPT active? This is the true false. So is it true or is it false? All right, correct. It is false. You don't need authorization for non-US based employment, and OPT is specifically for US based employment. I love the emphasis on the no, false from Teresa, so thank you for that. And then how often do you have to report employment? We touched very briefly on this, I think, but this one's a very important one. Oh, no answers. Okay, maybe we need to reiterate. So employment should be reported within 10 days of a change. Ideally, you want to report it immediately. As soon as possible, you report it, but definitely within 10 days of changing employment, of gaining new employment, of your employer moving addresses, you want to make sure that you report within 10 days. So with that in mind, how often do you have to report employment? We'll talk about how we report employment. But essentially, as soon as possible, you report your employment as soon as possible. And if there's a change in employment, you have 10 days to report that. Sounds good. All right, we can move on to the next slide. Thank you for that. Responsibilities during your OPT, obviously you're going to monitor your unemployment days. And if you've been hired and happily working since your OPT start date, but you never report it, remember that employment in your CBASE can terminate. So it's important for you to read so that you can go ahead and report at all times. So here are the responsibilities that you have. Report address and employment changes within 10 days of the change. Perhaps we'll think about moving the slides next year. You cannot backdate or pre-report your employment reporting more than 10 days. So it's important that within 10 days, you submit that report because we cannot backdate and you cannot pre-report. We talked about the kinds of employments that you can have. All employment should be related to your major, and it should be within the dates in your EAD card, right? So you want to make sure that you only work during the dates listed on your EAD card. You're going to continue to monitor those unemployment dates, and you're going to monitor your work eligibility. After your program end date, this was one of the questions that we were asked, page 1 of your I-20, you cannot work on campus once your program has reached its end date until you obviously have received your EAD card and the start date has been reached and the employment is going to be related to your program of study. So now about reporting, someone asked what to do when we report. So we'll tell you now. Once you're approved for OPT, you'll likely get an email from SCVP portal, and SCVP portal will essentially be the place where you can review your address and your employment information. It'll typically be within 2 weeks of your authorization date. You can submit your reporting in your SABP portal, but you can also submit your reporting in ISSA Link. In fact, we recommend that you use ISSA Link. ISSA Link, you'll continue to use ISSA Link to report. And this will be helpful simply because if you report something and there might be a mistake, maybe you transpose the numbers or the dates, it'll have an extra set of eyes, we'll catch it, and then we'll let you know, hey, was this accurate before we submit the reporting. And on top of that, you will need an updated travel signature from time to time. And when you report employment, if it's new employment in a different city or a different state, you'll want those changes reflected on your I-20. And so reporting with ISSA Link really helps that happen. If you don't have to do both, reporting on ISSA Link is enough, or reporting on SABP is enough. But again, we recommend you report on ISSA Link and then you just confirm that everything looks fine on your SABP portal. For those students that are going to be eligible for the STEM extension, your I-20 requests for filing and for reporting will always be on ISSA Link. So it's just a good habit to begin using ISSA Link for all reporting. Additionally, after you're done with OPT, or if there's going to be changes, or if you're going to apply for your STEM extension, you also want to use ISSA Link as noted here on the little yellow box. And then how to access ISSA Link. So once you leave the university, you will likely lose access to your Notre Dame email. You probably want to use your personal email when submitting your application. In fact, we ask for your personal email when you apply for your OPT I-20, because you will lose access to your ND email if you're not going to be employed here. And so you will still be able to access ISSA Link after graduation. You will access it differently. You'll be asked to access it with the limited service PIN, which is going to be pretty easy. You'll log in with your information. If you don't remember your PIN, you can always request it at the bottom of the page and then just return to go back to ISSA Link to submit your report. And now we're back to Zane.
Yes, wonderful. Thank you. Dulce, there's some questions I did not get to finish answering. Okay, and just a quick note about from the previous slide about accessing ISSA Link. You will be able to continue accessing ISSA Link as per usual until the end of your program. So you're not going to have to worry about this until you lose access to Okta, which usually happens about 60 days after graduation. So if you're like, I can't access ISSA Link the normal way, you still have access. You just have to go through this separate way. And that will usually be after the 60 days post-graduation. So information about a future status. So this session, as you can tell, was not discussing the 24-month STEM OPT extension. As we mentioned, even those of you who are eligible for the STEM extension are not applying for it right now. You are only applying for the first 12 months of OPT. And if you meet the STEM eligibility criteria a year from now, you'll start that process around that time. So at this point, what is it that you should know about STEM OPT? STEM eligible students apply 90 days before the end of their current OPT. So if you're applying for your first 12 months of OPT, and let's say your end date is in July of 2026, well, then you'll start thinking about STEM OPT in April of 2026. So not something you're worrying about right now. You can't apply more than 90 days before the end of your post-completion OPT. Before the current OPT that you're applying for, you'll apply 90 days before the end of that OPT. And this should have been updated. It was a typo. It is also a $470 filing fee. So that I-765, you're going to be refiling it for the STEM extension. So you will need to pay that $470 fee once again with that STEM OPT application. Again, that is not an ISSA fee. That is for USCIS processing. So H-1B and OPT applications. So we know some of you have already asked in the chat about potentially transitioning from your F-1 status to an H-1B category. So the first question that we get asked can I apply for H-1B, or rather, can my employer sponsor me for H-1B? And can I apply for OPT at the same time? And the answer is yes. These are separate applications with USCIS, and the applications do not conflict. However, we at ISSA generally recommend to all students that you maintain your F1 student status for as long as possible. Or rather until you have a formal approval for a new status. So many of you, some of you may be working for employers who are not subject to the H-1B lottery. But for those of you who are working for like industry positions where your employer would be subject to the lottery, we advise that you go ahead and apply for OPT. And so that way, for example, if your employer sponsors you and you don't get picked in the lottery, then you still have your OPT and you can be working in the US. And then potentially, if you have a STEM extension, your employer sponsors you again for the following year. So you have multiple chances. For those of you who are working for employers who are not subject to the H-1B lottery, even if, let's say, your application gets denied for the H-1B, at least then you still have your OPT to continue working. Or if there's a significant delay for whatever reason in processing your application, you would still be able to work on your OPT. So our advice is to, again, use that F1 status for as long as possible. You get this OPT benefit. It's kind of like a use it or lose it. You can't save it for later. So we would advise go ahead and apply for OPT. If ultimately you end up changing status, the only thing you'll have lost is that $470 application fee for applying. So in terms of not having a lapse in your work authorization, for most students, they'd say it's worth it to apply for OPT. The next question, if I get chosen in the H-1B lottery, when would my status change? So if you're chosen in the lottery, we recommend that you reach out to ISSA once you're approved for H-1B status. And that way we can make sure that your record is updated. When would your status change? Well, it depends on how your employer files the H-1B application. And so the answer would be different for many of you. And so we can't necessarily answer that question right now, but if you have questions about it, once you're in the process and once you have more information from your employer about the H-1B petition, we may be able to help answer some of those transition questions about moving from F1 to H-1B. The important thing is just that whatever, if you change status to any other status, you keep ISSA aware just so we can update your F1 record and make sure that everything gets updated accordingly so that your record is accurate. Do I need to work for my H-1B employer while I'm on OPT? No, you do not. Like we mentioned, these are separate applications. If you have a job that is within your major field of study and you're working on OPT, and separately you have another employer who's willing to sponsor you for an H-1B, that's fine. There are distinct regulations around employer for each of them. We at ISSA cannot formally advise you on your H-1B status. So if your employer is sponsoring you, really we would say direct any questions around that application to the employer or their legal counsel, whoever is filing that petition for you. So other types of U.S. employment authorization questions. So how can I keep working in the U.S. after my OPT expires? This is a really common one. So there's no guarantee that you'll be able to continue working in the U.S. We can't give you that guarantee. You have this OPT benefit. Some of you may have employers that are willing to sponsor you. Even sometimes we had in the last year students whose employer sponsored them, but then ultimately they got laid off. We can never guarantee what's going to happen. Employment sponsorships aren't guaranteed, and sometimes students may be working with resistant employers, the job market, layoffs, all of these are possibilities. So it's kind of an impossible question for us to answer. If you have specific questions about what your immigration options are, we would encourage you to speak to an immigration attorney since they can really more holistically lay out your options for potentially remaining in the US in a different immigration status after your OPT ends. What are the other kinds of employment authorization? So work authorization is limited in general in the United States. We have a video on our website that outlines other potential pathways. And like I said, you could also choose to consult with your own immigration attorney, which would of course provide a much more tailored response to that question about kind of potential other immigration pathways. So similarly, what are my options after OPT? Potentially sponsorship. A lot of students have employers who are willing to sponsor them for an employment-based immigration status, H-1B, sometimes employment-based permanent residency applications, whatever have you. Some students, for example, our undergraduate or our master's students who are here today, if you ultimately apply and get admitted to a graduate school, maybe you work on your OPT for a year and then you transfer your F1 record from Notre Dame to another institution to pursue another degree. So that's always a possibility. A lot of students will do that. Some students, like one of the examples that we gave earlier in the presentation, some students get great jobs outside of the United States or in their home country. And so they choose to leave sometimes during their OPT, sometimes afterwards. So all of these are potential options after OPT. It is very student specific. So some FAQs, and I should mention that we also have a webpage just about FAQs for students who are on OPT. And a lot of these questions are pulled from there. There are a lot of other questions on the webpage, so I would highly recommend checking out that webpage because you've probably had some of these questions at one point or another. What is my status while on OPT? We covered this in the check-in, so all of you know, you guys are great, that you are still in F1 status while you're on OPT. Do I need a job to apply for OPT? No, you do not need a job to apply for OPT. My major STEM designated. Don't I apply for 3 years instead of 1 year? No, you apply for 1 year, and then about a year from now, if you meet all of those STEM OPT criteria, which if you're like, what are those STEM OPT criteria? We have a STEM OPT webpage, interestingly enough. And all of those are listed there. So no, right now you're only applying for that first 12 months of OPT. If you're STEM eligible, you'll apply later. Can I change my OPT dates later on? So this question is often referencing the OPT requested authorization dates. Like we mentioned earlier in the presentation, if you request your OPT I-20 from ISSA with particular dates, and then you don't apply for OPT yet, and you decide very quickly, oh, actually, I want to change my dates. I just got a job and I want to be able to work on this date. Totally fine. If you have not submitted the OPT application to USCIS, ISSA can change your dates. If you've already submitted your I-765, that becomes a lot more difficult. Typically, we don't advise it. You would have to formally withdraw your OPT application. You'd lose your $470 and you'd have to refile. It's very frustrating. It's time consuming and we don't advise it. So make sure that you're confident with your dates before you submit that I-765. How do I know when I'm authorized to work on OPT? Well, like we already saw, you know that you're authorized when you get the approval notice and then also when you get that pretty little teeny tiny EAD card in hand, you know that you are authorized to work within the dates listed on that EAD card. What if I find a secondary job on OPT that is not related to my major? This is a really great question, and it's not possible, unfortunately. All employment that you pursue while on your OPT period has to be directly related to your major. So just because you have a great 8 to 5 job that meets the criteria does not mean that you can take your weekends and start driving for DoorDash, for example, unless somehow you can make it clear that driving for DoorDash is directly related to your major field of study, which I'm not sure that that will be possible. So any and all employment has to be related to your major. Someone asked in the Q&A, how do I make that clear that it's related to my major, or how will they know? OPT employment is all self-reported. ISSA is not investigating you, but it is important for you to understand that USCIS could ask you follow-up questions about your employment, maybe not now, maybe a few years from now if you're applying for OPT or permanent residency. So just keep in mind, whenever ISSA is advising you, we're always thinking about your immigration record long-term, not just right now. So maybe it's not going to be an issue for you now. It could come up in a few years. So anyway, it's all self-reported how it's related to your major. Dulce gave us some great examples of what that might look like. If you have particular questions about a job that you're not sure is related to your major, feel free to reach out and we can work through it with you. A few final reminders about work authorization. So the first one is that this is your responsibility to be managing this OPT application process, just like it's been your responsibility to manage your F1 status during your time at Notre Dame. We at ISSA are here to help you answer questions. We're here to advise you. We're here to give you kind of other things to think about. But really, it's your responsibility to manage this process, to meet the timelines, the deadlines, to make sure that you're reaching out to ISSA if you have questions. All of that is your responsibility as the student. If you have any employment opportunity while in your authorization period, make sure that you report it. That was something that Dulce did a great job kind of reiterating to you all, that every kind of employment that you have on OPT has to be reported, whether it's paid, whether it's unpaid, whether you're working for 1 day, 1 week, 1 month, the whole year, it all has to be reported within 10 days. The next thing, if you have an opportunity outside of your authorization period or your major, you must decline it. Like we said, if you are not authorized for work, you cannot be working. It would be in violation of your status. Since all the employment on OPT has to be directly related to your major, if you have an opportunity that is not related to your major, unfortunately, you're going to have to decline it because it's not aligned with your F1 status. And we understand that sometimes that means saying no to some really great opportunities. Like I said, when we're advising you, we're thinking about your immigration record holistically now and 10 years from now. If you're applying for some other immigration status, we don't want short-term things that you do now to impact you 10 years down the road. If you have any questions about your OPT application, or if you have any questions about your F1 status, again, ISSA is the only department on campus that should be advising you about the rules and responsibilities of OPT, about your immigration status. We are here to support you. Of course, hopefully you felt supported by us through your Notre Dame program, but we are also the sponsor of your immigration status during your time on OPT. And so any and all immigration questions can be directed to us, or at least we'll be able to point you in the right direction if it's not something that we at ISSA can answer.